Before I introduce our next speaker, I remember the Chief of Staff mentioned Commandant Peter Young and Victor Lang and the foundations they put in place for the military archives as it is now and the institution that it's grown into. So I think it's a great testimony to what they did and what they set up, the fact that somebody has travelled all the way from the United States to be with us today. So I'm going to introduce our next speaker, Professor Timothy D. Hoyt, who is Professor of Strategy and Policy, John Nicholas Brown Chair of Counterterrorism Studies and the Academic Director and Senior Mentor of the Advanced Strategy Programme at the US Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. Dr. Hoyt is the author of Military Industries and Regional Defence Policy, India, Iraq and Israel, and over 50 articles and chapters on international security and military affairs. He is currently working on a multi-volume study of the strategy of the Irish Republican Army from 1909 to 2019, as well as projects on the Indo-Pacific region and trends in international terrorism. Ladies and gentlemen, presenting a paper on the strategy of the anti-treaty IRA 1922 to 1923, please welcome Professor Timothy D. Hoyt.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction, and thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. I know many of you from previous events with the Military History Society of Ireland, both in person and via Zoom. But it's a pleasure to be here, and especially a pleasure to be asked to talk about strategy in the Civil War. I have to start with a disclaimer. The views that are expressed here are those of myself alone. They do not represent the views of the US Navy, the US Naval War College, or any institution of the US government. In fact, insofar as I know, the US government takes no position on the Irish Civil War. I'm not even sure it knows it exists. That's why I'm allowed to come here and talk about it. I'd also like to just state again as well, my views here are not intended to criticize any of the actors. I believe that everyone involved in the Civil War was a patriot. They had shown their patriotism and had suffered in the War of Independence, and what happened in the Irish Civil War was a tragedy. I'm going to evaluate the performance of the two sides and the strategy of the two sides, but that should not be interpreted as a judgment of any particular person, of their characters or morals or anything like that. Strategy is the process and the plan that links military operations with preferred political objectives. And that usually is referred to in the context of war. And what I've put up here, I'll refer to Karl von Clausewitz a number of times during this presentation, because Clausewitz provides a framework for thinking about war and the relationship between politics and military operations. These are his definitions, some of his definitions of war. There are actually about a dozen in the book on war, but these are, I think, some of the most pertinent, especially for the purposes of understanding the Irish Civil War. War is nothing but the continuation of policy with other means, and war is a clash between major interests which is resolved by bloodshed. That is the only way in which it differs from other conflicts. These definitions accept the predominance of politics in war and view war as a form of negotiation with the addition of force. That sometimes is a hard concept to accept, especially for Americans who tend to think about war as something more existential. But the idea that war is a negotiation with the addition of force often helps explain the outcomes. War is a tool, military force is a tool to influence that negotiation towards a political objective. War is an act of force to compel our enemy to do our will. I think this is more often taught in military academies and command and staff colleges. This emphasizes decisive military victory, an act of force to compel our enemy to do our will. But decisive victory is rare in practice, historically. And then the last two, essentially war is fighting, and war is the realm of chance. No other human activity gives it greater scope. These definitions take politics almost completely out of the equation. And they look at war purely as a phenomenon of fighting. And fighting, in some respects, becomes fighting for its own sake, and chance is the element that determines victory or defeat. Tolstoy might believe in this, if you've read War and Peace. This approach may capture the views of some of the more hardline anti-treaty leaders and explain both the absence of strategy and the absence of political considerations as they prepared for and then fought the Civil War in 1922 and 23. I'm going to blitz through a few more Clausewitz quotes in the interest of time. This is about no one should start a war without knowing what they intend to achieve by the war and how they intend to conduct it. And in this case, looking at the political objectives of the anti-treaty leadership, is not particularly clarifying. The anti-treaty leadership appears to have two main objectives. There are several factions among the anti-treaty leadership, which I'll get to shortly. The most important, which is repeated constantly, is defending the existing republic. This assumes that a republic existed as of 1916 and then was validated by the elections in 1918, revalidated by the elections in 1921, codified in the first Doyle in 1919, that this republic had meaning. And it is clear for the leaders of the anti-treaty movement that this idea of a republic had enormous meaning. They were willing to fight for it. What it didn't have was practical reality. The republic did not really control very much territory. It peaked in terms of political influence probably in the mid-1920 period, and after that went into decline. There were institutions that represented the republic. There was a shadow administration and a shadow government, but the republic as a consolidated political entity, which all of the people agreed with, existed more in the mind than it did in reality. A second objective that we see voiced is rejecting the treaty. Rejecting the treaty also, by the way, is defending the republic. The treaty is viewed as an assault on the republic because it repudiates it. It makes a deal with the British government, it accepts partition, it provides an oath to the king, it attaches the new Irish Free State to the British Empire. Both of these objectives implicitly renew the war with Great Britain. They don't have a viable end state. What they do is they reopen hostilities with Britain because Britain has made it clear in negotiations, both with De Valera in July and then with the treaty negotiators from October to December, that it will not accept a republic and it will not accept independence. So what, at basis, the anti-treaty forces want is to renew the war with Britain. That's not an end state. In fact, it might be a recipe for disaster. There are a couple of secondary objectives that also appear in anti-treaty statements. One is to maintain the army under an executive, independent of the government. And in this, they share some common ground with some interesting people on the provisional government side. Both Collins and Mulcahy keep a line open to try and create the possibility, perhaps, of an army that is much more autonomous than what the civilian leaders of the provisional government and the Free State would like. Also to defend and liberate the nationalists in the North, which Eunan has spoken about eloquently. The objectives of the provisional government were a bit simpler. Implement the treaty, secure control of the institutions of the new Free State, avoid renewed war with Great Britain, and then pressure Great Britain for maximum advantage through a number of different steps, mostly political. Try and use the Constitution to create a more Republican Constitution that would sort of undercut a minimalist definition of the treaty. Use the Northern Campaign to pressure Britain and to pressure the new Northern Irish province, and to maintain army unity if possible. Understanding the nature of the war, the kind of war on which you're embarking, neither mistaking it for nor trying to turn it into something that's alien to its nature. And in this case, it's important to recognize that the Irish Civil War, the war that is to come, is going to be an internal war. It's going to be a war among Irishmen within an Irish political institution. Thank you. Thanks very much. That's important because we know something historically about the character of internal wars. When two sides are competing to govern a given political area, both sides are competing for the allegiance of the elites and of the population, and both sides are competing for legitimacy, both in the domestic arena and in the international arena. And that legitimacy comes from things like control of territory, the establishment of law and order, political representation, effectiveness, and responsiveness, in other words, administration of controlled areas, economic stability, and winning an ideological battle. Now, why does this all matter? Well, there's a long period from January until late June where there is an ongoing competition between the anti-treaty side and the provisional government. And that struggle is over legitimacy, and it's waged primarily in the political arena. The legitimacy dilemma is a real one. The treaty divides Sinn Féin. And the treaty not only divides Sinn Féin, but it actually divides the Republican movement. The TDs who were selected in 1921 and ran without opposition were selected by Michael Collins, Harry Boland, and Diarmuid O'Hegarty, the heads of the IRB. So the figures in the treaty debate the political leadership, are on the more extreme Republican end of this large umbrella organization that is called Sinn Féin. And even they divide 64 to 57 for a narrow acceptance of the treaty. The Republican movement and the Republican institution of the Dáil has been irrevocably split over the treaty. And that's important because that then there's a need to create new legitimacy. The anti-treaty sides tend to rely on Republican symbols, and the provisional government tends to create new institutions and put new facts on the ground that will consolidate its political power and authority. The provisional government marginalizes the Dáil. It basically takes over for the Dáil. The Dáil exists, but it is no longer a decision-making body. The Army executive at the Army conventions, first in March and then later again in April and June, marginalizes politics and rejects, for the most part, any work with civilian government. In fact, Rory O'Connor goes so far as to say that the first Army convention means that the Army rejects the Dáil itself. Now, he's on the most extreme end, I would argue, of the anti-treaty faction. The symbols of the Republic are eroded, and the longer war is avoided, the more powerful and legitimate the provisional government becomes. And this is very important because the anti-treaty side recognizes it's losing the political battle, but refuses in a period before the conflict actually begins to coordinate or create any kind of competitive response. They don't set up capable staffs. They don't set up a shadow administration. They don't try and reinforce other Republican institutions like the Republican courts or the Republican police. These were things that they could have done politically that might have firmed up their contestation with the provisional government, but they failed to do it because they were averse to politics. Clausewitz also has a concept called the Remarkable Trinity, where he looks at forces that decide war. I'm just going to elide over this. I will be glad to talk to people at it at length over coffee, because it's complicated. But basically, he says that war tends to be determined, the actions of war on each side tend to be determined by a combination of factors, one of which is emotion, passion, hatred. Because war is fundamentally different from politics. People are dying. So once war happens, people begin to hate, emotion intercedes, and people make worse decisions. Similarly, war is the arena of chance. Once you start a war, there is no guarantee that you will win it or that you will get the outcome you want. You can use war to try and shape an outcome, but there is no guarantee that you will achieve it. And so chance is a very powerful element in any conflict, and we see this in the Irish Civil War. Last but not least is the element of rationality, which is supposed to be imposed by government or leadership, which shapes the struggle towards a definable and an achievable objective, and uses violence to achieve that, trying to moderate the other effects or risks of violence. This comes out in looking at three different elements of society: the government, the people, and the army. And Clausewitz uses this as part of an assessment process for thinking about what you need to know before you go to war. You need to know something about your enemy's capabilities and your own. You need to know something about the character and abilities of their government or leadership and their people, and you need to know something about your own. You also have to evaluate the political sympathies of the other states and other parties involved, because they may intervene or that may be important. And most important, you need to know the political aim and that of our enemy, the objectives that I put up a moment ago. Again, public support in internal conflicts is perhaps the center of gravity. And the struggle for political support begins the day of the treaty vote. It actually began during the treaty debates, and continues up until June 28th, when the Civil War officially begins with the attack on the four courts. The IRA won the War of Independence, insofar as it was a victory, primarily through public support and politics, as well as through military contestation. The treaty vote determines or demonstrates the divisions in Sinn Féin. Republicans tend to overinterpret their support. They look at the symbolism of the 1918 election and the voters' approval of the Republic, and assume that, therefore, all voters support the same Republic that they do. This is probably overinterpreting the level of support that they have. The 1922 election actually indicates, although it is not a vote specifically on the treaty, it indicates that rejection of the treaty is not the primary concern of the vast majority of voters. About 22% of the vote goes for anti-treaty candidates, and about 78% of the vote goes to people who think something else is the most important thing. Right? That's an indication of political support. You have Irish Trade Union Congress general strikes against militarism. You have De Valera forming a Republican Party that most of the anti-treaty military leadership doesn't agree with because they think that document number 2 is not a Republican solution either, which is accurate. You even have comrades with mixed feelings who show up in the neutral IRA, which numbers as many as 20,000 in early 1923. Former comrades who refuse to fight. They may reject the treaty, but even more, they reject fighting a civil war in Ireland. And so by June, the anti-treaty side has lost the political battle, at least temporarily, and that puts it in a bad position if it's going to try and fight and win a civil war. Now, on the anti-treaty side, there's some military strengths and weaknesses. The biggest military strength, of course, is numbers. 60 to 80% of the IRA opposes the treaty and is represented at the Army Convention in March of 1922. The IRA is better armed than it was in 1921. It has battle-hardened troops. It has veteran commanders. And these commanders believed that they had won a military victory over Britain. They believed that they had never been defeated. They believed that if there had not been a truce, that they would have won. Those are all important markers. They have some weaknesses. There's no unity of command. There's an anti-treaty executive, but it's 16 people, and they have wildly differing views and political objectives. They're divided about fighting the provisional government until the provisional government actually attacks them. They're very regionalized. There's little cooperation across unit boundaries, and this continues through the Civil War. It minimizes the impact of their superior numbers because they can't mass in large bodies, and because they're not used to conventional warfare, their leaders aren't used to all of the issues that are engaged with moving and sustaining large forces over space and time. They're defensive-minded and actually succumb to something that Mao Zedong would call guerrillaism. Their preferred way of fighting, which we see becomes sort of de facto strategy, is to retreat back to their home areas and fight guerrilla warfare. That is something they were good at. It was something that they were effective with, and they assumed that it will work again. And the biggest issue is that their advantage is a wasting asset. Time is not on their side. And as the provisional government buys time from January to June, they become stronger every day, and the anti-treaty IRA becomes weaker. Now, I'm going to just touch on this. There are many strengths that the provisional government has. The most important strength, I would argue, and I've argued this before in front of the Military History Society, is the GHQ staff. These people actually know how to organize. And organizing is as important as having good fighters if you're going to carry on a war, and especially if you're going to try and conquer and administer territory. The fact that most of the GHQ staff and the most capable GHQ staff stayed pro-treaty is very important and helps describe the success of the National Army in 1922 and 1923. They have access to some assets. The formation of an independent national army is important because it is a non-territorial force, and therefore it is flexible. They can move it from one area of the theater to another. It is much harder for the anti-treaty IRA to do that. Troops from Kerry don't show up in Sligo very often. They have command problems, and they also have logistic problems with doing that kind of activity. The provisional government and the National Army do this much more easily. On the other hand, they do have some weaknesses. They have a weak presence in the South and West. There's a heavy reliance on Dublin officers for leadership. And there's a reliance on Great Britain, which is a potential significant political problem. Great Britain is critical for arming and supporting the National Army. But at the same time, that could be turned into an unpopular political stance. Leadership on the anti-treaty side is divided. You've got a political faction under De Valera, which is marginalized by the Army executive, at least in part because De Valera is making primarily an argument for document number 2, and it's a very self-interested argument. He wants to become the head of the Dáil again somehow. Document number 2 is not a Republican document. It is a stepping stone document, the same way that Collins describes the treaty as a stepping stone. It's moving part of the way towards the Republic, but it's not going to get you there for a long time. You have a faction primarily concerned with Army unity and autonomy, led by Liam Lynch. And then you have other factions who take over the forecourt that are more radical, that seek a republic and seek to reject the Doyle, which will put them in direct competition with the provisional government. Again, that group is a minority. It's a very vocal minority, but it's a minority. The Army executive is suspicious of politicians. And then in June, the elections and the June 18th Army Convention divide the Army executive. And I think that's important. Even just before the four courts, you see Tom Barry puts up a vote to immediately attack the British forces, which would, again, ensure the Republic and hopefully reunite all of Ireland against a common enemy. It's rejected by a 118 to 103 vote. And Liam Lynch opposes it. So you have a Lynch faction, and then you have an O'Connor and a Mellows and a McKelvey faction in the four courts. That creates a weakness for the anti-treaty forces at the very beginning of the conflict. The provisional government also has divisions in leadership. We can talk about that in Q&A if you want. But what they are doing is methodically increasing the provision of basic services, which again emphasizes the legitimacy and the capacity of this new provisional government, which in December will become the Free State. They also take over police functions, and they reassert judicial functions. Again, assuring that they have legitimacy and authority and capacity in the event that war breaks out. The beginning of the war is an accident. It's an act of chance. I believe a civil war would have been inevitable. I don't think it necessarily had to look the way that it did. I think in this case, there was a forcing function, and the forcing function was the assassination of Sir Henry Wilson. That led the British government to put pressure on the Free State, and it led the Free State, one of whose primary objectives was to avoid getting Britain to restart a war. It led the Free State to make the momentous decision to attack the four courts. Interestingly, the Army executive were warned on the night of the 27th that the attack was coming. They had at least 12 hours warning. They chose not to evacuate the four courts and to accept the attack instead. On the anti-treaty side then, when the war begins, you have a poor policy strategy match. The anti-treaty side is fractured. The political message of the anti-treaty side is marginalized. There was effectively no policy. Lynch becomes the head of the anti-treaty movement simply by virtue of being the consensus chief of staff of the Army executive. His policies are uphold the existing republic, which again has little concrete meaning. He says there's no alternative policy to the present one of fighting, so fighting becomes a policy in and of itself. And he says at one point in a letter in September, he hopes to strike hard to make developing policy easier, but he neither strikes hard nor develops policy. So as a result, in the early period, the IRA is really on its heels. There's no effort to form a Republican government until the war was basically lost in late October of 1922. And even when they form a Republican government under De Valera, they don't pay any attention to it because the Army wants to have autonomy. So the Army the Army executive runs the Civil War until the death of Liam Lynch in April of 1923. Strategy. What passes for strategy is surprisingly passive. There is no coordinated effort to retake Dublin, even though forces are available at Blessington as early as January 1st or January 2nd. A column could have struck into Dublin and attacked the city while there was still a defense on Sackville Street. That doesn't happen. There then becomes an idea of holding the Limerick-Waterford line and fighting as guerrillas elsewhere. And there's an inability to coordinate forces to take the initiative or to hold territory. And that really helps explain what happens in the first months of the conflict. The provisional government, on the other hand, immediately takes the initiative. It utilizes a firepower advantage. It clears Dublin quickly, and then it moves to contact with anti-treaty forces and engages them as quickly as it can throughout the defended area. It ensures control of Limerick. It takes Waterford and breaks the defensive line. And then, as Ewan pointed out, probably the most difficult combined arms attack to improvise is an amphibious assault. To do it when you don't have a navy and when you don't have a trained army, and to pull it off requires both extraordinary staff work and planning and also a great deal of luck. And the National Army has both in the landings across the southern and southwestern coast. How did each side intend to win? This is another indicator of strategy. Well, the provisional government was hoping for what in military terms we call a quick, decisive victory. Every military hopes for a quick, decisive victory. The idea is if a war starts, you try and pin the enemy forces as quickly as possible, overwhelm them, and then the other side has to make a tough choice. Because if their army has been mauled, they can either fight more, which will be very costly, or they can begin negotiating and make some concessions. Again, quick, decisive victories are fairly rare in history, but this is what it appears the provisional government is looking for. Seize the four courts, capture the leadership, and then hope to utilize splits in the anti-treaty spectrum in order to negotiate some kind of a peace. And this is not a crazy theory of victory, because on August 12th, De Valera urges the Army Executive to consider ending the war after it abandons Framoy, because there is no longer a chance of military success. So De Valera is pointing out, we can't win this militarily. We should instead negotiate and get the best deal we can and work towards another day. The anti-treaty forces, initially they massed to fight for Dublin, but then Oscar Traynor, who's the head of the Dublin Brigade, shows up and says, we shouldn't fight for Dublin. Let's go for guerrilla warfare. So the forces scatter instead. Then they Lynch tries to limit the geographic dimensions of fighting to the Dublin area by negotiating a ceasefire with compatible provisional government officers in Limerick. That only lasts a couple days. The provisional government sends much more hardline guys to Limerick, and they start the fighting there right away. When that doesn't work, they decide they're going to fight for the Munster Republic. That fails because of the landings and then because of attacks all along the Limerick to Waterford line. So they retreat to their traditional strongholds and fight in flying columns. They're hoping here to foster kind of public support through continued resistance and to pressure the provisional government into negotiation or collapse. This was, in fact, a serious concern in October of 1922. We've seen a number of memos within the provisional government that they are concerned that these tactics might work. I've already talked about a lot of these points. These tend to explain the military effectiveness of the anti-treaty side. Most have to do with lack of unity of command, inability to coordinate disparate units, inability to come up with a successful defense plan, and the loss of the initiative. Wars then, after the first phase, go into a period of interaction where both sides think about what are the alternatives. And in these periods of interaction, they may decide to step up their efforts. They may decide to increase the resources that they put towards the conflict. They may, in fact, decide to change their political objectives because of the way in which the war is going. I'd argue that there are about 5 points in the Civil War where one side or the other could have considered a significant change or thought about making some kind of concessions to create negotiations. The first is in August 22. At the time that the Republicans or the anti-treaty forces are basically routed, there's a leadership vacuum. And although peace feelers go out, because there's a leadership vacuum on the Free State side, on the provisional government side, it may be they are not quite as creative as they could have been. Collins was actually a fairly deft diplomat and negotiator. He had a lot of nuances. He kept a lot of balls in the air. Losing him affects the diplomacy and the flexibility of the provisional government. On October 22nd, you begin to see some of that flexibility. There's an amnesty offer. There's support from the church condemning the anti-treaty side. And then the provisional government passes an emergency powers bill that allows military execution. That might have been a time when the anti-treaty side would have said, things aren't going very well, maybe we should try and find a way to cut a deal. Instead, they doubled down at the Army Convention and said continued resistance. Deasy's offer to surrender, again, is perhaps an opportunity. It's one that the anti-treaty forces don't seize. In March 1923, this actually was a time when arguably, the anti-treaty side really should have reconsidered its position. 16 out of the 18 commanders in the 1st Southern Division tell Liam Lynch, now the Chief of Staff, the former head of the 1st Southern Division, that they cannot win a military victory. Lynch says we'll keep fighting. So it's only after Lynch's death that you have a change of leadership within the anti-treaty forces and where De Valera is actually allowed to function as a government in control of those forces. He puts out proposals for some face-saving gesture, which are rejected by the Free State government. And as a result, the anti-treaty forces dump arms and cease resistance, but they don't make a surrender or any kind of admission of failure, which is what really the Free State was hoping for. They wanted an absolute victory. What explains the outcome? Well, very briefly, I would say the Free State gets too harsh after the deaths of Collins and Griffith. It's understandable why they get harsh. They're in the midst of a bloody and ugly civil war, but there was more opportunity, I think, for a face-saving gesture to De Valera earlier. Their frustrated expectations of victory at the end may lead them to push harder than they needed to, which meant they didn't get a satisfactory conclusion. They got an end to the fighting, but not an end to the war. And that plays out in the history of the Republican movement ever since. Anti-treaty forces simply failed to adapt. And by the end, armed resistance has become an end in itself rather than a means to any other political goals. And it's only after the death of Lynch that they can sit back and reassess and have some very close votes in the Army executive about what happens next, 5-5 and 6-5. But they finally decide it's time for us to stop fighting. They failed to understand their adversary. They misjudged the capabilities of the National Army. The GHQ staff, again, proved very capable, and that non-territorial National Army proved much more flexible. They failed to understand that their opposition to the treaty put the provisional government on what Sun Tzu, the Chinese strategist, calls death ground. If you say, we're going to reject the treaty, it means that you're going back to war with Britain. And that was the reason that Collins and Griffith signed the treaty, was to end the war with Britain and buy Ireland the space to develop as a nation and as a functioning state. The demands, however they're couched by the anti-treaty side, are utterly unacceptable to the pro-treaty side. And that's why after 6 months of negotiations, the pro-treaty side decides to initiate hostilities. Another thing is understanding power. Power is about not only capabilities, which we've spent time talking about, but also will. And it is here where I think, again, the anti-treaty side dramatically underestimated the leaders of the provisional government. Not just Collins, not just Griffith, but Mulcahy, who I have a great deal of respect for historically. Mulcahy was especially ruthless in this conflict. The first time he met De Valera around Christmas 1921, De Valera told him to study Machiavelli. I don't know if he studied Machiavelli or not, but his decisions on executions were very Machiavellian. They were the hard decisions. In order to end this conflict, we must start killing our own, and we must do it deliberately and sometimes cruelly in order to end this war quickly. Those are not easy decisions to make. And Lynch clearly was stunned when he heard that his comrade Mulcahy had done that. I think that that was an area where the anti-treaty forces truly misunderstood the adversaries they were fighting. They also misunderstood economics. Their attacks on economics alienated political support, alienated elite support, and alienated international support. They may have been necessary in order to fund the movement, but they were self-defeating. Now, a couple of reasons for ending a war. The first is improbability of victory, and the second is its unacceptable cost. This is ultimately why De Valera orders and Aiken order dumping arms. We can't win, and the cost we will pay for continuing to fight. 13,000 Republicans are in prison in April 1923. We can't do this anymore. The other thing, though, is that peace is often ephemeral. Even if war ends, one side may consider it just a transitory moment. because the political contest continues. And that's very much the case in the Civil War. An honorable defeat is accepted by the anti-treaty side, but this political conflict over republic and treaty continues in the political realm. The anti-treaty side ultimately failed because it ended up militarizing a political conflict and then not being able to fight effectively. But it had some alternatives, right? The alternatives, however, were things that it could not carry out with the organization in place. It could have struck the British anytime between January and June. It could have launched an offensive, and they tried to in a coordinated way in the Northern Campaign, cooperating with the provisional government. They could have struck the British on the 24th or 25th of June and started the war themselves. And in fact, Barry urges them to do that, but they can't agree to do that. The other thing they might have done is try to force an overreaction by the provisional government. But even when the provisional government responds with severe measures, they're unable to capitalize on it politically. So they find themselves in a position in which they cannot win. Did the provisional government miss some opportunities? This might be worth thinking about. The provisional government had its hands tied up until the moment it became the Free State, because it was dependent on Britain. And this is what made the Constitution a problem, because Britain vetoed a Republican Constitution. Once it becomes a free state, however, it's a legal entity. It may have more maneuvering room with Britain on the margins for a whole bunch of things. And we see in the diplomacy of 1922 to 1925 that the Free State is effective at some things, it's less effective at others, particularly the Boundary Commission. However, it is effective in working with other dominions. So it may be that opportunities were lost by the Free State in its relationship with the United Kingdom, that it could actually have manipulated the Civil War as an excuse to say, well, I need wiggle room here, I need wiggle room here, I need wiggle room here. And those opportunities were lost. That might be worth pursuing at some point. The other thing is that pushing the anti-treaty forces to the limit means that the anti-treaty IRA dumps arms and continues to stake its legitimacy on the second Doyle. That might have been avoided. And with 20/20 hindsight a century later, we see that this connection to the second Doyle remains in the Republican movement for the following century to be a very important factor in legitimizing the revival of the Republican movement in various generations and in reviving the use of political violence in order to create a republic. Finally, looking at the anti-treaty assessments from 1923, Moylan, I think, captures the fundamental problem of the anti-treaty side. It's not about being able to win. It's that we're right, and therefore we can't surrender because we're right. We just have to keep fighting. That's an astrategic position, but it may very well explain what the anti-treaty side was doing. Aiken, if we have to fight another war with the staters, we better make it short and sweet and seize control right away with conventional forces, something they might have done in January. It's kind of a lessons learned perspective. O'Malley said that they need the support of the people and they can't fight defensively. De Valera, this interesting quote about the body of the Republic is concerned, it's dead. The soul and spirit and form continue to exist. The formal existence of the Republic will continue with its authority residing in the members of the Second Doyle and in the trustee executive. Again, providing this continuity that we see historically becomes more problematic even after De Valera takes power through election. But what we do see in the 1923 election is there is strong support still for a more Republican position. And the struggle between republicanism and treaty shifts from the battlefield eventually into domestic politics and the parties that emerge from the Civil War and that remain dominant parties in Ireland today. So provided Republicans could accept an end to abstention, they could still now fight for what they wanted in the political arena. And in fact, in 1932, in a very unusual action for a country that's just fought a civil war, the losing side takes power through a democratic election, and that process is followed democratically, and the winning side accepts a minority in opposition status. That's all I have to talk about strategy today, and I really appreciate your listening to me, but I hope it was informative.
Well done, Tim, and thank you for a very interesting paper. I think it's always a very valuable activity, especially within a military context, to apply strategic studies and people like Sun Tzu and Clausewitz to this period of history in question. So very fitting and a great start to the first section of our conference. Thanks very much. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to have, after we've had two great papers on the high-level stuff, after our coffee break, which is going to start now, we will resume in, we say 11, it's 11:21 now, 11:22. We'll resume at 11:35. We're going to go into three fascinating papers on key individuals: Emmett Dalton, Liam Lynch and Richard Mulcahy. So if you'd like to take a break now, use the bathrooms, get a coffee, get a tea, get a snack, and we'll resume in 15 minutes. Thank you very much.